Well, good. Well, welcome one and all. I'm glad you guys are here. So we'll begin today. I'm going to do something slightly different that I haven't done before in our reading. Well, for those of you who have the book, and I know you like to follow along sometimes in the book itself, we are beginning this morning on page 35, which is the beginning of chapter 2. So as always, I greet you, Benum Christinet. It's nice to see you all here. Benum Christinet, for those of you who are not familiar, is a beautiful Celtic expression that means I greet Christ in you. So we tend to begin and end that way. I'm going to call up the screen share for you and just to bring us to our opening prayer before we begin. And then instead of posting the words of the text for you today, I'm actually going to post an artwork that I reflect on in the first paragraph. And I thought it might be nicer for you to actually see the piece of artwork that you may otherwise not be familiar with. So that might be a nice way to read through. So let's begin in prayer today. So open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weakness. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me tenderness for my toughness. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me. So once again, our reading today comes from page 35, and the chapter is called O Happy Fault, and we'll talk about that momentarily, subtitled Salvation, History, and the Interior Life. And my opening quote comes from Dante Alighieri in the Divine Comedy. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward path had been lost. A very famous quote from Dante. So here is the image, if you'd like to have it in front of you, that I will be reflecting on in my opening paragraph today. So if it helps you to follow, and I'm describing in a sense this image, and I'll be building upon that description across the chapter that we'll be looking at. So I thought it might be helpful to have that. In fact, the image you're looking at here was in some sense the second contender for the front cover of the book. But I ultimately wanted something a little less literal. But in any case, the front cover may well have ended up looking something like that. All right, so beginning then the first paragraph of chapter 2 on page 35. In my personal study, there hangs a reproduction of Giovanni di Paolo's famous 15th century painting, The Creation of the World and the Expulsion from Paradise, which, as its title suggests, seamlessly portrays the dual scenes of creation and the exile from Eden. Reflective of Renaissance cosmology, a two-dimensional Earth dominates the lower left of the portrait, surrounded by concentric circles depicting the orbits of the sun and celestial constellations. In the upper left, an anthropomorphic image of God basking in golden light and held aloft by angels, points conspicuously toward the creation below. To the right of the portrait, Adam and Eve take their first steps into exile, escorted by an angel in the foreground of a lush garden reminiscent of Dante's depiction of paradise in the Divine Comedy. So I'm going to leave that image depicted for you throughout the meditation today, if some of you would like to focus on that over the time that we are in our meditation. And it's at this point that we typically take our 25 minutes, or 25 minutes of meditation. So I'll call that up for us. Okay. So our second reading this morning comes from page 36. Artistically compelling, I have found Apollo's masterpiece to be a rich source of contemplative rumination, vividly capturing that moment in which Christian tradition recalls humanity's fall from grace. Apollo brings us to the threshold between life and death, full of tragedy and regret, alienation and loss, but without which we can hardly begin to appreciate the unbounded joy, eternal hope, and fullness of life held out by the gospel. The first steps of Adam and Eve into their exile is at once the first step along the human pilgrimage back to God, or rather, God's pilgrimage back to us. For the Christian, exile does not end in return, but in the embrace of a God who rushes out to greet us while we are still on the way. Indeed, each of us is an Adam and Eve caught up in the divine embrace long before we realize it. Thus, the disastrous impulse of humanity's rejection of divine intimacy has come to be glorified throughout Christian history as the, quote, necessary sin or happy fault that provoked an unbounded, indeed incomprehensible response of God's love and compassion. O truly necessary sin of Adam, destroyed completely by the death of Christ. O happy fault that earned so great, so glorious a Redeemer. And as we'll see in our discussion next week, that quote there is from the Exultet, which is read in most liturgical churches every Holy Saturday at the Easter Vigil. So we'll come back to that, sort of exploring that little quote there in our next time together. But for those of you who need to go before our discussion this morning, I have a closing prayer from 1514, an unknown author. It's called the Sarum Primer Prayer. God be in my head and in my understanding. God be in my eyes and in my looking. God, be in my mouth and in my speaking. God, be in my heart and in my thinking. God, be in my end and at my departing. Okay. So then I open our time this morning to any discussions. Yes, so just a couple of questions that come up. The title of the book we are reading, for Sue's question, the title of the book is Contemplating Christ, the Gospels and the Interior Life. I published that in 2018 with Liturgical Press. Oh, sorry, I see you put it there, Robert. Thank you. I didn't see your response. My apologies. Okay. So I open the floor, as I always like to, by first asking if there's any questions that you'd like to ask that might be helpful, or comments you'd like to share. And I see, Vinny, your hand is up. Go right ahead, please.
Yeah, I just had a question about the necessary sin.
Mm-hmm.
Is he saying that we needed to walk away, or we needed to create the illusion so that we could then experience God's great love?
So the short answer to your okay, let me start with a little bit of a longer answer. So this is I quote this because it's from, as I mentioned, the Exultet, which is an ancient Christian hymn that introduces what Paul will, in his letters, later expound upon, which is this notion of, as he says, wherever sin did abound, grace did abound the more. And really the point of the Exultet, because of course it's chanted on the one night of the year that we celebrate the miracle of resurrection and all that that implies. The point is more poetic than in a sense doctrinal, and as you'll see throughout this chapter, I'm going to come at that statement from multiple angles, including the one that you're asking. So first, I want to just say, I want us to think of this in terms of the religious impulse toward poetry and art and a kind of exuberance around an experience. And that experience is the farther I fall, the more the love or the grace of God reaches into that messiness and raises me up. So everything in Christ, in a sense, gets reversed. Everything gets turned around and for the better, for love, for the divine. And so what the Exultet, which I cite here, is praising is is in a sense sinfulness, or that necessary sin of Adam. And Adam, of course, is that mythical being that represents all of humanity rather than one particular person from an ancient past, say. And what he's saying is that sin, which we should take not as a historical moment, but as an ongoing reality in all of us, provokes not wrath or condemnation, but provokes the mercy of God and the grace of God. And therefore, even those things that we might do or become, or engage in, sin, to put it in a simple term, becomes a moment whereby the grace and love of God can be proven greater or larger or bigger or more all-encompassing. And Paul will be very clear when he goes on to say, though sin did abound, grace did abound the more. his very next line is, but does that mean that we should therefore become more sinful in order to provoke the grace of God? And he says, no, that's not what I'm saying. Don't go there. But what he is saying is that where there is human failing, there is grace and mercy unbound. And so in a sense, we'll run into a number of problems with this, at least when with this poetry, when we try to over literalize it, because first we have to realize, as we'll talk about in depth later in the chapter, that the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis is meant to be taken mythically, which means there was no real time in the history of the cosmos, or certainly the history of our planet, whereby there was a garden called Eden in which two people were planted in a real physical way. We know, and we'll talk about this too, that in an evolutionary universe, we're here in the realm of mythology, whereby Adam and Eve are really metaphors or pointers to all of us. We're all Adam, we're all Eve. And so once we literalize it, as periods in the church have done, it ends up distorting and really throwing a curveball at what we really mean by salvation and the purpose of the incarnation. So to put that as simply as I can, if Adam and Eve are conceived of as historical beings who actually ate the forbidden fruit on a tree forbidden to them, and that moment becomes thought of as a historical, concrete moment that we can point to in the space-time continuum, right, of the cosmos, then what we end up with is the incarnation, the coming of Christ, being really talked about as what we call a kind of plan B. So God intended everything to be wonderful and like Eden. We screwed it up. And so then God had to come up with a plan B to fix it, right? And that, for many Christians, actually, for centuries, was kind of a presumptive way of thinking about salvation, that is indeed why Jesus came historically. That actually distorts, and the more beautiful or more in-depth theology behind the incarnation, which is to say that the incarnation or the coming of Jesus is not, in fact, a plan B. It is what God has always intended as the fulfillment of union between the divine and the human. And we can only continue to appreciate that when we properly put the story of Adam and Eve as a kind of mythical story that speaks not literally or historically, but really speaks about the life and experience of all of humanity. It is, in a sense, the story of each of us coming of age. And we have terms for that psychologically, the capacity to start recognizing that I am not my mother. And we call this the separation of subject-object relations, where I am not you and you are not me. And then there comes, as Father Keating talked about, or as I'll talk about even in this chapter, the kind of the woundedness that comes out of unmet needs and the temptation to step on someone else to get ahead, and all of these things which are mythologized in the perception of Adam and Eve eating an apple or a forbidden fruit. It's not actually an apple in the Bible. We all just have come to think of it that way. So, the very long answer to your question will be fleshed out over the course of the next several months as we actually focus on this very point throughout this chapter. But I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of where we should start by distinguishing this story as a mythical rather than historical one. And then everything that precedes is really I want you to understand this beautiful exalted hymn is the religious impulse toward poetry and toward art and toward that which is not merely doctrinal or rigid or descriptive, but what grows out of our experience of joy at, wow, even when I fall, God's depth is there to raise me up again. That as we'll come to say later, based on the beautiful reflection of von Balthasar that has become something of a mantra of my own in my own spiritual life is, in the cross, God wanted to fall or to sink so low so that forever after all human falling would be a falling into him. This is profoundly beautiful. And in a sense, the exalted is coming at that same truth from another direction. Despite our sinfulness, God's love and mercy and capacity to save expands far beyond that and will always encompass it. There will never be something that can happen that would be larger than God's capacity to make it right. So here we'll see that this chapter really is all about Christian optimism around the notion of the world and God's capacity to bring us through every trial. Does that help, Vinny, give you a sense?
Yeah, definitely. I was just sort of coming at it from does the necessary sin provoke God's grace, or is the necessary sin necessary for us just to understand that it was always there in the first place?
Yeah, I think the necessary sin would be provocative of God's grace. That, as we'll see, God's response to human sinfulness. First of all, we'll have to define what we mean by sin, which I think many of us have very distorted notions around, at least the scriptural notion of, so to speak, missing the mark. But the idea is that, yes, our failure, our sinfulness, our missing the mark on a regular basis, both in small and sometimes tragically huge ways, provokes not condemnation, but healing grace, right? That God's response to sinfulness is not eternal hellfire per se, but God's response to sinfulness is healing grace. Thomas Keating offers a beautiful analogy by which he speaks about sin in terms of archery, and basically says, the idea is, if sin is missing the mark, then it's our job as archers to get the bullseye. And he sort of proposes the notion that, well, if God is the master archer who in divine perfection always gets the bullseye, and I am just the mere mortal who is trying but is new at the game, and I keep missing the mark, well, what is an archer going to tell you the first time you shoot an arrow and miss the mark? Well, it's not going to say, well, you're condemned to hell forever. He's going to say, well, pick up another arrow and now try again, and try again, and try again, and try again. And so virtue becomes something we cultivate, not something that immediately is something we can be perfect at, or perhaps even ever. But as we practice virtue, we more often hit the mark, or at least get closer to the mark. And that's a very different thing than shooting arrows in the complete opposite direction of the bullseye, which is to say, not even to attempt a life of virtue, right? So in a sense, it's that encouragement that Keating wants to point out, that this is really the way in which we should understand the relationship between God and sinfulness. What's required when I fall is simply to raise up my hand one more time, right? That the whole of the Christian life is about getting up one more time than I fall, is about picking up one more arrow than the last one when I miss the mark. And the optimism of divine grace is the capacity we find or discover within ourselves to do just that. So it is a profoundly, while Christianity has a very unabashed, unflinching approach to evil in the world. We see this in our central symbol of the cross, and we know what evil is capable of. And Christianity does not flinch or sugarcoat that, but that's because behind that is a profound optimism around grace to absorb and to transform that evil into resurrection, death into life, right? So we'll explore that very much, and you'll see that it is precisely sin that provokes grace, if you want to say, which is to say, the optimism of Christianity insists that no sin could ever be bigger than God's capacity to forgive and transform it. So we actually celebrate the sin insofar as it's an opportunity for, once again, God's grace to be manifest as greater. Right. So we'll come.
Father Vincent?
Yes, is that Mary?
No, it's Christine. I can't find my little blue hand here.
Oh, that's okay. It would be down in your participants. So Christine, go ahead, and then I'll take Mary Millet's question.
Okay. Well, I just had a question about the beautiful painting.
Yes.
I didn't notice a snake in the garden.
Yes.
And I thought how wonderful if there was no scapegoat.
There is a little bit of a rabbit down here, if you see.
There's
right.
a bunny.
Yep, a little rabbit. Sign of resurrection, by the way. Yeah, it's. I think that what he's trying to capture here is the moment after. This is sort of the moment after they've been found sort of hiding behind the bushes, as we'll see, and being now taking their, as we'll see, first steps into exile. And it's those steps into exile that become the actual journey of God back to us, as we'll talk about in that cycle of the spiritual journey. But yes, you are right. He did not depict a snake that I'm aware of. It's well observed. Okay, sorry, Mary, go right ahead.
So would you say what you were just talking about is a definition of redemption?
Certainly, it's certainly a definition of redemption for sure. And did you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, I wanted to, I never really understood what redemption meant until after one of the school shootings. I was talking to a pastor, and the concept that no matter what we do, we are still able to be channels for goodness. No matter the level of evil, we are still capable of being that channel of goodness. And I'm wondering if that's what you were saying.
Yes, and I think it is. It's certainly one dimension, or not. At least it's not inconsistent with what I'm saying. One of the elements of the opening pages of Genesis that we have to remember is that while the church has and does talk about original sin, and we'll explore what that means. Even though it's only a couple of pages into a very big, long Bible, we actually are created originally innocent, right? That before this moment of the so-called the human lapse or fall, or what we would call the pre-lapsarian time, the time before the fall, humanity is created good. And so in that goodness, if you want to say, there is an affirmation by the Jewish and Christian tradition that evil or sin is a second moment, right? It isn't, we aren't created sinful, we are created good. And what we'll see is that what the tradition calls sin is illusion. It is, as we'll see, this illusion of separation. To come back to this painting, to meditate on that, here we see that remember, we're dealing with art, poetry, mythology here, not doctrine. So you see here that Adam and Eve are being accompanied, albeit, actually pushed out of the garden, which is the symbolic place, if you want to call it, or state of being of the awareness of oneness with the divine. And the exile represents the grand illusion that gets introduced into the human condition, which is the notion that we are in fact separate. That illusion provokes God to come seeking after us again, right? To come to come to unite or to lift that veil of illusion, to bring us back into the awareness of our union with God. And we'll be exploring the implications of this again throughout the next several paragraphs, so this next several weeks. But what we call original sin is the grand illusion, and that illusion is that we're separate from God. And from that experience of separation comes all of what we would think of as sin and evil in the world. All the striving, all the grasping, all the dissatisfaction, all the competition, and everything that comes out of that. So the mythical notion or idea of being ousted or exiled from the garden is to say the veil of forgetfulness comes over us, whereby we fail to live as if and as though we are in fact one with the divine. And that from there stems all of the world's suffering and all of our crises around what we would call sin. and it's what the incarnation comes to, if you want to say, reverse, right? So in a sense, the incarnation becomes a historical response to the human condition, which is expressed in the story of Adam and Eve on a mythical level. Right? And myth is a story that never happened, but is always happening in each of us. Right? So the incarnation, that means that the incarnation is the transformation of each of us in our own life. Marcia, no, I think that those, you're asking about the brown strips, they don't represent snakes, they represent the various rivers that were believed to flow out of Eden. That's what those represent, actually. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, but yes, but I could see why you would think they do look a bit more like snakes than water, actually. Cindy wrote a beautiful comment, you know, all day in the monastery, we fall down and get up, we fall down and get up, we fall down and get up. That is the human condition. We fall down and get up, and we get up by the grace of God who lifts us up. Right? All we have to do is extend our hand and ask for it. Yeah. Very nicely put, thank you. Linda, go right ahead.
So if creation is the first step, if you will, and the fall or leaving the garden is the second, how does that square with original sin? Like a baby is born in original sin. With
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the question is, how do we conceive of original sin? And first of all, the church has, unfortunately, what gets often trickled down to congregations is a really watered down version of a complex theology, in this case of sin. Original sin does not imply personal guilt, right? There is, a 2-month-old infant isn't guilty of anything. So for example, there's things like original sin, which does not incur a sense of personal guilt. But then there is also personal sin, which would, in a sense, be something that I am responsible for morally. There's also social sin, for example, which are sins like what we're discovering now with the murder of George Floyd and all of the protests coming out of that. We are all part of a society that collectively bears some responsibility on what it means to create a society that is just for all. Am I personally responsible for the murder of George Floyd? No. But have we all helped contribute to a society in which racial injustice and inequality continues to exist? And yes, we are. And so we all have a collective responsibility to respond and to transform that, in our case, through the work of the gospel. So original sin is often thought of as somehow having confused with personal sin, which is to say it impugns some kind of guilt. And that is simply not the case theologically. The best way to think about original sin is that as infants, we are all born into a world that is broken. And I think we could all agree our world is broken. And because of its brokenness, coupled with this illusion of separation that we all have psychologically as we evolve, as we grow, as we mature, these things in combination present us with a world where it's easy to hurt someone and difficult to reconcile, where it's easy to inflict harm and difficult to heal and to make up for that. So the very context or the structure of a broken world presents itself in such a way that competition, judgment, fear, anxiety, jealousy, right, hostility are easier than virtue and forgiveness and self-forgetfulness. And because of that, we all struggle in a broken, complex world in which it's hard to disentangle our own engagement, say, in how the world is racially unjust, how we have implicitly or explicitly helped to create that or to even maintain that. It's difficult to disentangle ourselves from that. And so as a child coming into the world, what baptism does isn't so much as wash away some stain of sin, as much as fills a glass that's half empty to overflowing, that the waters of baptism take whatever is deficient in us and makes it to overflowing, thereby giving us the grace within the context of community to be countercultural, to stand against the tide of society, which would otherwise have us so easily fall into what becomes just a state of brokenness or weakness or incompleteness, into actual social or personal sin. And therefore, baptism makes no sense outside of a community that's going to surround us with love and help us to to live into that fullness of our being, which the grace of baptism is meant for. So once we begin to disentangle the complexities of the way that the church has recognized evil in the world and the ways in which we get engaged in it, willfully or not, once we begin to disengage that, we start to see that there's a lot more nuance and complexity, and we should not come to think of infants as culpable of anything. They don't have the will to be just yet, right?
Beautiful. Thank you.
Oh.
Although I have found when my daughter was an infant, she was culpable of really bad diapers.
Yes, I will give you that one. Yeah, that's right.
No, thank you. Seriously, thank you. That was perfect and beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, and just so you know, we'll be, for those of you who felt that might be a little bit much in too short a time, that this chapter will begin to untangle those things in a much slower way. So we'll keep coming back to that diamond and turning it around. So let me just see very quickly, and then we'll move on, because I'm aware of the time. We'll move on to our discussion of practice. Just a few questions here I'd like to try to respond to. The big circles, the big circle app actually in the picture here, this big circle that you're talking about represents all of these they're faded now, but all of these were actually like signs of the zodiac. So these represent the various constellations throughout that are found in the universe. And these, here you see again the rivers that are also represented down here. And so all of these circles represent basically the celestial bodies and what's called in Greek the ouronos, the heavens, as it were, that surround the earth, which is centered here around Eden. It's a beautiful picture. Okay, and then there was... the question is, was it a mistake to interpret the Bible from Greek to Latin? It wasn't a mistake, because it was just like translating the Bible from Greek into English. It was translated in a way that would give more people whose dominant language was Latin access to the scriptures. I do think it's problematic, however, to interpret our Bible today from the Latin, only because you're going from, every time you go to a different language, every time you translate, you kind of lose something. So any translation would be more accurate to go back to the Greek directly, rather than through various stages or levels of interpretation.
I totally agree with you, but the question was really, I'm Catholic, and when I went to a theological conference one time, they said there was a particular verse that Jerome translated incorrectly, and they caught it later, and they said, and maybe St. Augustine mentioned it in a speech or whatever, and that's where we got the condemnation original sin concept, but it was really based on an error that Jerome had mistranslated. Does that make sense? Had you ever heard that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but the bigger picture would be not so much that he mistranslated one word or one verse, but that it again, when translating from Greek to Latin, you know, or from Greek to English, you are losing something, right? But it's what in a sense, what Augustine, who sort of devised the notion of original sin in the 4th century, arrived at through his Latin, it's a much bigger, thornier question than merely the fact that the Latin isn't exactly representative of the Greek. He went off on a whole
Okay.
other tangent.
Okay.
Yeah, but he did sort of in the West set that trajectory of how we're to understand original sin, which we can come to at another point, because it's very different than the Eastern Orthodox, which is that glass half full idea. In the West, he really did conceive of it as a spot on the soul that the waters of baptism wash away. And that spot is transmitted through the act of sexual intercourse. This leads to all kinds of problems. Yeah, it's deeply problematic. I much prefer the Western conception, but yes. But we're not beholden to Augustine here. There's a larger Christian tradition that would provide other ways of thinking this through than his very sort of sex-based, for him, as I think Richard Rohr said, original sin is a sexually transmitted disease, right? Which in a sense is how Augustine came to think of this. And it does present a lot of problems about how we're to think about the sanctity of our body and the sanctity of of sexual relations and the beauty of that. And the West in some ways is still clinging to that, and I think in ways that we shouldn't be. Yeah.
Right. And no, I like your way much better.
Yeah, which is the more Eastern Orthodox.
The Eastern way, right?
Yeah,
that God is always coming to us and always heal in a healing fashion rather than a condemning. We're the ones that condemn each other for sin. So
that's right. And in the West, original sin is conceived of as a something, say a spot on the soul, as it were. It's something. Where in the East, it's conceived of as a negative. It's something that should be there and isn't. So it's seen merely as a deficiency. So the waters of baptism in the West wash away a stain that's there. The waters of baptism in the East fill us where the glass is only half full, say. And that's a much more positive, and I think not an approach that isn't based on human sexuality. But of course, we know that Augustine really had issues around sexuality and out of dualism. And, he came from a kind of a cult tradition before he converted to Catholicism that deeply continued to inform his theology. And we have to be able to tease that out. It's a much thornier issue than we can cover today. But unfortunately, in the West, that Augustinian thought gets trickled into us. And we really do think through. I mean, even the notion of the Immaculate Conception referring to Mary is rooted in Augustine. And it's why the Eastern Orthodox don't accept that, because it's Augustine saying, for some miraculous way, when Elizabeth and Joachim, the parents of Mary, had intercourse, they were preserved from that stain, from passing that stain of sin to Mary, and therefore her Immaculate Conception. Well, that only works if you accept Augustine's notion of original sin, that it is passed through sexuality, right? So and the Eastern Orthodox say, well, we don't accept that model, so the Immaculate Conception just doesn't make sense to us, right?
Or ever virgin, that she was ever virgin. I'm like, seriously?
Yeah, well, there's issues there, right? So all of these things get tied up, and we're now beginning to untease them, to untangle them, right? So we'll have chances to look at some of those thornier issues. Okay.
I think Dwight had a question.
Okay, please, and we'll make that the last, just so we can get to our discussion of
Dwight, you were raising your hand.
Oh yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I just put that in writing, but unfortunately went straight to Father Vincent instead, sharing with everyone. But the question I have is, from what you explained initially to Vinny, that would my understanding would be that we begin as Adam and Eve from a state of innocence or naivety, and in our attempt to grow, we all make mistakes. So we miss the mark. So it's a continuum. It's part of the human nature, I would say that way. So it's not something that happened sometime in history, therefore we're all guilty by default, but we all experience the same process over and over because it's part of the human nature. Am I correct in interpreting or understanding that way based on the picture you presented there, the art work?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Dwight. I think the notion that a myth is a story that never happened but is always happening. It's because it points to a reality in us, and we now have the field of psychology, just over a little over 100, 150 years old or so, to speak more to the truth of how, as we go from infancy and innocence and all of that into these later developmental stages of competition and unmet needs, and what Thomas Keating called the human condition, which means that the story of Adam and Eve repeats itself in every human life, in every human being, in all of our experiences as we come to that. And the incarnation repeats itself in each human life as we come to recognize the divine grace that overcomes all of those ways of being separate. So what you're speaking to, Dwight, I think is just a modern psychological way of pointing to the same truths that the myth of Eden was trying to address in its religious, mytho-poetical way, if you want to say.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
Of course. Okay. That was a little heady. I'm sorry about that. I know sometimes it's a lot of information in a short time. The good news is you can go back and re-listen to it. And the better news is that we're going to unpack that super slow over the next couple of months or so in here. So we'll come back to those ideas and really give you a chance to chew on them in small bites. So let me then pause here. And for those of you who need to leave, Ben and in it. I hope you have a lovely week. But for those who like to stay, I want to present real quick our practice for the week, and then get into our discussion of our practice for this past week. So here's what I'd like you to consider doing. Meditate on a painting or sculpture or work of art that resonates with you, challenges you, or maybe even disturbs you, and write a brief reflection, poem, or response that arises out of your meditation. Or if you prefer, you can draw, paint, sculpt, photograph, or sketch a small piece of art in response. What is your response to the work of art that you chose to meditate on? Thomas Merton always talked about the beauty of meditating on art and poetry, and even listening to music as a form of meditation. And given my my presentation of DePaulo's piece in today's presentation, I thought it would be nice to see what some of you are finding beautiful, or what's resonating with you, and how you respond to that work of art. Okay. All right. With that in mind, then, we can focus a little bit on last week's practice. I'm going to leave up here this week's if some of you are still writing, just for a moment. But if we'd like to open up a discussion on last week's practice, that was as follows. Take time daily to listen to the voice of African Americans, either through someone you know, a book, articles, documentaries. Just take time to listen with honesty and openness, and simply notice your interior response. Now, this, of course, is important work for us to be doing now, particularly as contemplatives. It is no small irony that one of the greatest social commentators out of the Christian tradition of the last century was Thomas Merton, who was a contemplative and ultimately even a hermit. And so his deep well of contemplative practice made him such a relevant social commentator. And as we are sort of unfolding at this moment of I think, a shift in consciousness among Americans, I thought, and I think there are resonances of this the world over. I just would invite you all to do that. So let me stop the share and then see who might like to begin. Okay, Joanne, no problems. See you soon. Okay, so Any takers? Sylvia, you'd like to begin?
Yes, if this is all right, I would like to read, it's 3 relatively short paragraphs. It's by Clint Smith, who is a beautiful Black American teacher, poet, author. And this is from his book, My Hopes, Dreams, Fears for My Future Black Son. And I think it would just be beautiful to share it. It's not that long. Son, I want to tell you how difficult it is to tell someone they're both beautiful and endangered, so worthy of life, yet so despised for living. I do not intend to scare you. My father, your grandfather, taught me how to follow a certain set of rules before I even knew their purpose. He told me that these rules would not apply to everyone, that they would not even apply to all my own friends, but they were rules to abide by nonetheless. Too many Black boys are killed for doing what others give no second thought, playing our music too loud, wearing a sweatshirt with the hood up, playing with a toy in the park. My father knew these things. He knew that there was no room for error. He knew it was not fair, but he loved me too much not to teach me, not to protect me. I hope to teach you so much of what my father taught me, but I pray that you live in a radically different world from the one that he and I have inherited. I do not envy his task, one that might soon become my own. I tell you these things because I know how strong and resilient you will be, how you will take this fear and make a fort of this skin and turn it into a bastion of love against unwarranted inhumanity. You are not a mistake. You are not a deficit. You are not something to be eradicated or rendered obsolete. You exist beyond pathology. You come from my parents, who both protected me from violence and made me feel whole. You are the manifestation of their unyielding commitment to overcome. I hope the world you inherit is one in which you may love whoever you choose. I hope you read and write and laugh and sing and dance and build and cry and do all of the things a child should do.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Part of what strikes me about that is the universality of, I can imagine almost any parent wanting to read that to their child.
Right. Right. It just symbolizes the oneness within all of us. Or it expresses, I should say, not symbolize. Yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to share.
Thank you. That was worth reading. Thank you so much, Sylvia. I appreciate that. Mary, go right ahead.
One of the things that I listened to this week was very simple, but very wonderful, was the CNN coming together with Sesame Street to answer children's and parents' questions on race. And it was given by several people came on and spoke to children from all over the country who asked questions. And it reminded me of how we're not allowed to ask questions. And that there's this taboo that, for me anyway, there's so many questions I would like to ask, and yet there's not really a format for questions. And I think that some of the way that the children asked the questions and the response was so soft, with such a soft heart, and with such gentleness, and with so many smiles. It made me see what that arena could really do for adults. So that was just one thing that happened for me during the week.
Thank you, Mary. I share that sentiment. Everything feels so much at this point charged and like landmines. You're not sure how to ask or who to ask or what's the right way to ask or if you should ask. And this is, I think, actually unhelpful. But it's where we're at, and we need to be finding ways to ask honest and sincere questions in order to be good allies and folks who are going to work well for social justice for all of us. I'm hoping that's something we learn to overcome. Thank you. Yes, please. Hi, Rosemary.
What comes to me is that we are really experiencing a spiritual awakening. And it seems that we lived in a two-tier system. And I just feel that the pandemic, as well as the racial, the people on the streets, what they're saying, I feel that the pandemic has been able to help them to express their anger, if you will, which has been there, and they realize that this may be a time for them to speak truth to power, if you will, and listening to them. They are so articulate and in expressing their anger, and they really, I feel, have come into their own to be able to express what they have been feeling, this exclusiveness. And I think if we think about all this injustice, what is our response? How are we to respond to all of this? And I think, first of all, is awareness and prayer and reaching out and doing all we can to include everyone and to see that they too, the divine presence is within them as which is everywhere. And so we're all equal. And I think this, for me, is a real spiritual awakening globally.
Yes. Thanks, Rosemary. I agree with you. I think that's actually a beautiful way to understand what's happening, is I think a spiritual awakening and solidarity, for sure. Thank you for that. Well said. And I see, Judy, your hand is up.
I read this past week, Jason Riley, he's a Black journalist, and he wrote that the last weekend in May in Chicago, 18, mostly Black, 18 people were murdered on Saturday, and I think 25 on Sunday, and 85 people were wounded over the weekend. And I just, it hit me, every single one of those people has family, and all the people whose hearts are broken, and we don't hear about it. It doesn't, affect us in our daily life. And anyway, I had this heartbreaking moment thinking about each of those people.
It's always when it gets personalized like that, and when the real personalization hits you, I think that you start to realize we're not just talking about numbers or issues or concepts or laws. We're talking about human lives, and all that implies, and all those relationships imply. Yeah. I when my father passed in November, for various reasons that don't matter for this conversation, I we held his funeral on the East Coast, which is where my parents were originally from, and I had to carry his urn across, the country, going through security, airport security, which was a profoundly difficult thing to see, security guards take out an urn and have to wipe it for drug residue. And I will say that they did it with tremendous dignity, but it was a very painful experience to have something that's so deeply meaningful to be sort of treated like luggage. But on the way home, back here with the urn, the gentleman whose task it was to have to, check and wipe the urn down, was African American, and it was just after Christmas that we had arrived back here, and he could see that I was visibly, sort of emotionally upset at just having to do this, and he apologized and shared with me that he had just lost a 24-year-old brother several days earlier, who was shot. And we had from that this beautiful exchange, sharing sort of our grief. But, it just struck me that, all I kept thinking about was his mother. And I just said, I just can't even imagine what your mother is enduring right now. And I asked for her name, and I promised to keep her in prayer, and I still do, because there was some kind of connection I realized between that grief we shared, a very different grief. But I think about his mother so often, and I think about just like how in this one personalized moment, the gentleman who happened to be in charge of, inspecting my father's urn had also just days earlier had this brutal loss. And, those statistics are just over the top in this country. They're just over the top. So there you see that deeply personal, it just brought home on a whole new level. So we all grieve, loss is loss. And we can think about, George Floyd's mother as we would think of how any of us as parents would feel to lose their son, and how devastating that would be. I mean, that's the tragedy of what's happening here. So yeah, it's real. It gets very, very real when we humanize it in that way, and we understand it as in all that complexity. Dwight?
Father Vincent, I've been thinking about this. I'm reflecting on that, on this topic you gave us during the week, and coincidentally, was interesting to observe the repercussions of what's happening in your country, here in Australia. And initially, the Australian community in general took on solidarity towards what's happening in America, but that then translated into a problem that we have in our nation, which is the death of Aborigines in custody, which is quite serious because it happens mainly males and young ones, some of them even minors, and it seems that. Like you said, it becomes just statistics, and it takes very little importance amongst the rest of the community. So there's been a significant uproar amongst the community in general here in Australia. In the main capital cities, there's been protests and even the defacing of some statues that relate to the history of the Aborigines that were enslaved with the arrival of the Europeans to this country. and I could feel quite close the pain the people expressed in our local television channels, the interviews, and then you can feel that how much they suffer, how much they pain, and they beg for justice, and it seems to be lost in translation, so to speak. It's just disregarded. It's something that is important, is inadmissible. That's how I feel it. But yeah, there was some an awakening, as Rosemary put quite well, is an awakening for this inequality that we all experience around the world. Here in Australia, it's specifically with the Black population, our native population here has been severely disadvantaged along all this time since the beginning of colonization.
That's right. Yeah, and I think we're reaching a point in our history where we're really going to have to look seriously at that. I try to, if for those of you who might be interested, if you go to St. Columba's website, the first welcome page, and scroll down, you'll see in yellow and black a banner that says Black Lives Matter, a rally. And we coordinated a rally here, a protest last weekend. And you'll be able to click on an address that I gave to that crowd that was here. It was probably a little over 100 people. And I was invited to give an opening address, and I tried to look at this question about how we really have to go do the hard work now of digging deep. It's only a 12 or so minute address, but really what it means to look at the woundedness of all this on a real basis, and that it's going to hurt, because we have to face up to this cycle and to this pattern. So by all means, yeah, if that interests you, by all means, have a look at that. So thank you for that, Dwight. I appreciate it, and you're 100% right. I think every country has its work cut out. So we're almost at time. So how about Linda? Why don't you have the last word today, and then we'll go from there. Yeah. There you go. I just unmuted you. Oops. No, I'm sorry, Linda. Well, we competed with each other. Just unmute. Yeah, my bad.
Okay.
There you go.
A week or so ago, I sent her this book, The Cross and the Lynching, by James H. Cone. And it just came a few days ago. And I've been trying to, really go deep and figure out what would it be like, if I were born Black, what would the stories in her family be? What would all of that. And this is really helpful. He talks about, how the Blacks could identify so with the cross, because they saw it so like the lynching tree, an innocent person dying. And it's just been, an interesting book to read. And he's a very intelligent man, and a Black man. And it's very good. I'm learning a lot from it.
Yeah, I mean, that experience of lynchings became, in a way, what we talk about now as Christ crucified in and through us, right? So the way in which and part of his shock is, how is it that white churches never made that connection in this country? How is it possible that white churches can go on preaching and go on living and never realize that the lynching tree was Christ crucified in our own midst? How could they not have made that connection? And how that speaks to this abyss and this sort of this chasm between the white and Black communities here, that it seemed as if nobody was able to, or at least willing to, acknowledge that publicly. And so he explores that as well. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. I, like you, would recommend it. It's one of the books I'm thinking of in our opening book study of using that, because it really gets to the Christian experience in the United States, particularly of Black churches. So I think it's a difficult one to start with, but I think gets really to that wound I'm trying to address in the bifurcation.
I didn't get the title. Could we have the title of that book?
It's the Cross and the Lynching Tree.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, Martha, we'll make yours very last. Something quick you wanted to share?
Oh, thank you. I I just had seen this this post, which was very moving. There's a young African American woman. She's wearing a T-shirt, and on her T-shirt it says, "My skin color is not a crime." And she's holding up a sign that says, "Do all lives matter? Just asking for a child in a cage."
Mm. Yeah, it's powerful. Thank you for that. Yes, so we, and I think the question, do all lives matter, becomes the question about ongoing process here. We are clearly at a tipping point in this country, and I think, as Dwight expressed, it's actually reverberating the world over. Hopefully that is indeed, to Rosemary's point, a spiritual turning point as well. The question will be, after the rallies and the marches and the social, response that we're seeing around the world, how do we sustain our commitment to that and integrate our commitment to other issues of the day, the environment and the indigenous populations and women and all of these things? How does this become a sort of universal, unified, greater commitment, and in all its particularities? One of the things that I said to my congregation is we have to avoid the two poles. You can't do everything, but you can't do nothing, and you have to do something. The question for each of us is, what is that something going to be, and what part of this larger social justice issue are each of us in our own context going to be called to and engage in? But as contemplatives, we must engage. Contemplative discipleship overflows into social action, right? So we all have to do our part. Many of you I know already are doing your part, right? For many of us engaged in the life of discipleship, we've been working on various issues. This is a call to deeper commitment, and I think a call to more synthesized commitment, to see these things in new ways and to incorporate voices we might have, not integrated into our theological framework, at least as I'm seeing it. Hence the cross and the lynching tree, and looking at Howard Thurman's work and so forth on his contemplative work, really as a way of being not only concerned about how we'll respond, but how we hear, how we listen. So we not only have to look, we have to look and see. We not only have to listen, we have to listen and hear. This is the contemplative vocation. And then to allow those voices to transform us into contemplative action in the world. So we have our work cut out. We have to figure out ways to sustain it. I'll try to gradually integrate these things into what we're doing in a more conscious way as we move forward and away from sort of this point of real high tension. But if it's not sustained, then it's not going to, all of this will be for naught. And that can't happen. That can't happen. So thank you very much for sharing all of that with me. I'm excited to be actually getting into chapter 2. Chapter 2 was the first chapter I wrote, actually. Chapter 1 was the last chapter I wrote. And and everything else came in between. So I'm looking forward to moving into this, because we're moving away from trying to really set the foundation, and more so to look at the larger structure that's built on top of it around deification, and also it should be fun. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.